Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist's chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 32 with Amy Johnson of the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line. Welcome back, OTC listeners. Thank you for tuning in, as always. Today's episode is kind of a deep topic. It's a look at when therapy goes wrong, so when the therapist becomes the abuser. And a lot of listeners may be wondering, why are we talking about this? Does this stuff even happen? And that's part of why I wanted to have the episode and interview Amy Johnson with the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line, because abuse by a therapist does happen. And it's almost like sort of the Catholic Church where, it's something, we don't talk about it. It's very unpopular. That idea of Kaiser Soze and the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was, making the world believe he didn't exist. And not that there's this conspiracy theory that licensing boards are trying to keep this stuff under wraps, but it does happen. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of stats around it, and I would say that any stats that are out there are wrong, are low. This often goes unreported or underreported, and so I wanted to do an episode focusing on this. I have been aware of this for some time, just off of being a counselor in the state of Pennsylvania. They used to actually send out almost like a newsletter each month, and the back few pages of it, they don't do this anymore, but the back few pages of it were a list, almost like a police blotter, of counselors in the state that had their license, suspended or revoked or things like that. And I think you'll hear me say in the interview, anybody in the U.S. can go onto their state licensing board and look up, the different disciplinary actions, or if they have a specific therapist that they want to kind of check in on and just make sure everything's okay, you can search that person out and search their license. So some of the other way that I came to this was through listening to the podcast, The Shrink Next Door, which, if you're not familiar with, I would highly recommend you checking it out. It was a great podcast, just a gripping story about, I believe, a psychologist who engaged in abusive actions, I would say. So I wanted to do something around this to just try to highlight it, make people aware, and to provide with resources through the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line for who do you reach out to and what do you do if you suspect that you have been the victim of this, or you have and you want to pursue action or things like that. So just a little bit about Amy. She has a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and she completed advanced training in mind-body medicine through the Benson Henry Institute, as well as postgraduate study at New England Institute for Existential Psychoanalytic Therapy. So she also has been in private practice for many years as a licensed professional therapist, and recently retired from clinical practice in order to work with clients in a non-clinical context. And she also helps people understand and heal from abusive therapy relationships, and is a responder with the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line, which you can connect to at www.therapyabuse.org. So I have Amy Johnson here on the Couch podcast. Amy, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you, John. I'm so happy to be here, and I appreciate you tackling this very difficult topic.
Definitely. Yeah. Like I said, I've been looking forward to sitting down and speaking with you. So for the listeners, you're a licensed therapist, and you're also a responder with TEL, which is the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Therapy Exploitation Link Line. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how did you even get into that? How did you come to it?
Well, actually, I had been practicing for over 10 years before I ever even heard about TEL. And I discovered that one of my colleagues was sexually abusing a patient.
Oh, okay.
And it was, it was the biggest shock for me. Absolutely. Had no idea, never in a million years would have thought that this particular person would ever do something like this.
Sure.
And had never come across it in all my years of practice with colleagues. No, it had never been on my radar. It was something that I thought that only happened very rarely to, a different, like, it wasn't ever going to come near me, is what I thought.
Yeah.
Naively. And so, I had to figure out what to do, and began Googling after consulting with my my mentors and supervisors. And I came across TEL as really the only resource that I could find on the internet. No matter how much I looked, this was the only thing I could find to really help me. And even then, I was afraid to reach out to them because I wasn't a direct victim myself. But then as time went on, I did eventually reach out to them. And, that was when everything really started to change for me in terms of my own healing from the whole ordeal. Okay. And then I was nominated to be a responder, which was a huge honor for me because I'm the only one who isn't a direct victim, but I was definitely a victim of this type of abuse. It has far-reaching tentacles when these things happen.
Jeez. And that's sort of a double-edged nomination. That's,
Yes.
Congratulations. Thank you so much.
And thank you. I wish I never had to, but it is incredibly rewarding, and it has really opened my eyes to be, sort of on the inside of TEL, just to see how rampant this is in our field.
Sure.
Abuse of all kinds, not just sexual exploitation, but all sorts of exploitation. I think, from the Shrink Next Door podcast, that's starting to increase awareness about like all different ways that people can exploit in this field.
Well, and to be honest, I would echo that. We're both therapists. We you have to go do the continuing ed trainings. You have to do the stuff with ethics, and every ethics training is, geared towards scaring the crap out of you. And, at least once in there, they tell you, like, do not have sex with your clients, and then they usually also hit, like, document a lot. But I never have ever heard them say, what do you do if a colleague has, abused their client in some way? Or if you have a client that comes to you and says, hey, I had a therapist a year ago and they did, X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't remember that ever getting covered. I mean, maybe I missed that section.
No, me either. In fact, I was woefully unprepared for this. Just woefully. And I think probably everyone is, because I was very much into ethics and constantly doing my continuing ed in that because it just interests me so much. But this just wasn't even on my radar. And I remember thinking in my training and all through my years, like, well, who would be stupid enough to do that? Yeah. Let alone, why would you harm a client? We have such a privilege when people come through our doors, in their time of need, and we get to help them.
Sure.
Why would anybody take advantage of that who would go into this field, right? Then, and then just be stupid enough because you think, well, gosh, I'm not going to put all this work in jeopardy.
Yeah.
But it happens all the time. And it's because they don't think they'll ever be held accountable, and they often aren't.
And I almost found it to be like the sort of the older model of training towards personality disorders, where it was like, you'll never come across this in your practice. It's maybe 1%. Sort of that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was, getting the world to believe he didn't exist, kind of thing. Of like, people, I think, don't want to believe that it happens, that it exists. And I think also, psychology has had its rough spots of fighting for legitimacy and
Yes,
trying to break
true.
in as a hard science, and so I think also some of the like, we don't want to acknowledge that this happens.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of defensiveness in the field, and I certainly ran into that, when I was taking action
Okay.
and trying to get help. And even afterwards, even now, when I speak about it with certain colleagues, I can feel that, there's a resistance and kind of like, I don't want to, that's never going to come into my sphere, and I'm not interested. And that's only certain other people who do that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it is hard to accept, and it's in all fields. I try to stress that this isn't just, psychology. It's in every field. It really is. It's just part of human nature, right?
Unfortunately,
and
yes.
and so of course it's going to touch us, but I think we could be extremely well equipped to tackle it in our field if we collectively, as colleagues, were really there for victims and policing our own profession, from the inside.
Well, and that's a lot of what TEL does, is providing support, correct? So can you kind of explain what is TEL, what is the role? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, for example, if anyone reaches out to TEL, they would send us an email. They'd find us on our website and send us an email, which goes to a group of about 15 of us all over the world. So it's a small group of women.
And that's the therapyabuse.org?
Therapyabuse.org, yes.
Okay.
And there's lots of resources there. So even before you ever reach out to us, or any victim, family member, colleague, you can read, you can get a ton of information and resources there. And so if you reach out to us via email, one of us or all of us, will respond based on your inquiry. And we offer support and resources, and any questions that you want answered. We don't offer therapy, obviously, even though some of us are therapists. But it really is just a support line. Usually people have some contact with us, and then we get them on their way to healing and, sort of locally wherever they're reaching out from. Mm-hmm. And then they still might be in contact with us for quite some time, but there's usually like an acute phase where they're really trying to understand what's going on.
Sure.
And then we sort of guide them to where they can get in-person help in their area.
Mm-hmm. And I probably also with that of the what is it not? You said it's not therapy. It's also not legal advice.
It's strictly support. Yeah, so we're not going to be giving you any legal advice. It's not therapy. We're not going to get involved with your claim if you decide to make one. We're not going to sort of represent in any way or confirm anything that you've said to us. It's just we're really there confidentially. We don't connect victims with each other either. Okay. I know that's been something that a lot of victims would like, is sort of some group support, but just to keep keep everybody's situation confidential, we don't do that. Mm-hmm. But we certainly encourage victims to start their own groups if they want to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And moving into the different types of abuse that you see as a responder, what do you see?
Well, certainly the most prevalent that I see is emotional and physical sexual exploitation.
Okay.
That's the most common, and it can be, it's most commonly in the field. The therapist tends to be male and victim tends to be female, but many times it's female therapists. We're seeing a lot of that too. So I think a lot of it has gone unreported, and the abuse is subtler sometimes. So it can be emotional, financial abuse. It's a different type of manipulation with the client, and then sometimes it is certainly sexual as well. but the most common is sexual abuse and harm. And then you have kind of fostering dependency in clients where they feel like they can't get away from the therapist. And then we see, the stuff kind of veers into the shrink next door harm, where the person is just, becomes really isolated from their family, and the therapy becomes their only lifeline.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they sort of see their therapist as a guru that they need to rely on for everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I got to be honest. I mean, like I said, as a therapist and myself, how I came to hear about TEL was through listening to The Shrink Next Door, which for listeners, if you're not familiar with that podcast, I would highly recommend it. Maybe not above this one, but But the story of Ike Hershkowitz, who was a psychiatrist, and that abuse of power, and over years sort of slowly positioning himself as that guru, and sort of moving his clients to like cut themselves off from family and friends and things like that. And it was through hearing your colleague Jan that I was like, oh wow, I had no idea this was even a thing. Like, I've got to get in touch with TEL.
And we're so glad that you did. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. I think the same reaction you had, where I was just like, I can't even imagine. Like, as I was reading the ebook for TEL, just the like story after story of, just unfathomable. Like, I can't even like put myself in that mindset of like, how do they get to that point?
Yes, exactly. And it's a slow burn that they get to that point. And that's why it's so hard for us to imagine as therapists, like, how did it get there? But it's this very slow, methodical grooming process on the part of the abuser, the abusive therapist. And so the client over time, it's like water on a rock. And over time, the client doesn't even, it's so subtle that the client doesn't even know that it's so wrong. It really is grooming.
Well, and I really appreciated that in the ebook. Some of the writers explained, I'm writing this in a somewhat linear fashion as best as I can piece together, but it didn't happen that way. That this was like, I've put this down succinctly in a couple of paragraphs. This happened over years, little by little.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that The Shrink Next Door, also illustrates for us is that, Ike Hershkowitz was a prominent, well-known, well-regarded psychiatrist in Manhattan.
Yeah.
He wasn't, that was the other thing in my mind. I thought, only certain therapists who have no training and no ethics would do this. But actually, a lot of the abusers are very well known, so they tend to groom everyone around them. They cultivate an image and a reputation of being, really wonderful. And so it makes it even harder to believe, if anyone were to come forward, people won't believe them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the people who write into TEL, their abusers are very well known. They're in the media, they're experts, they're very successful therapists. And also, just to dispel the myth, that the victims are also tend to be extremely successful, intelligent, just like in the podcast, right?
Yep.
These aren't, damaged people. They are very well educated, very well accomplished, empathic, kind, pretty healthy people on other levels. And this is, so it isn't, a lot of people tend to think that victims are usually impaired in some way anyway.
Yeah.
It's not really true.
Well, and I think so many think of it as like, oh, well, this only happens to like children, it's only therapists that are working with children, preying on, the weak and the small and the voiceless, and that idea of, it made me think of human trafficking, which I'm familiar with from doing trainings, giving trainings on human trafficking. And Yeah, just the slow grooming process, and it mimics the domestic violence so similarly in terms of the cognitive distortions and
Absolutely.
the lies that either the therapist tells or that the victim comes to believe of, like, no one will ever believe me. I'll be ruining their entire career or their family, their friends. And especially in human trafficking, one of the issues that law enforcement runs into is, like, these people don't self-identify. They don't come forward as, like, waving a big red flag, like, "Hi, I'm a victim." You know, in your experience, is it almost like some of these situations get, like, stumbled across, where, like, you know, a client brings it up in passing, and then, you know, their new therapist is like, "Wait, what? Back up a second. What happened there?"
That can happen, absolutely. There's been a lot more awareness with Me Too, you know, over the years.
Sure.
But there are certainly people who they'll remember something that happened 20 years ago that still, you know, bothers them, but only now are starting to realize that it was abuse, because most clients think that it's consensual or that they even initiated it and they wanted it. And so they don't see that as abuse, and they have tremendous guilt over, well, I agreed to this. I'm an adult. It's not like, you know, but usually there, what happens, and the reason that a client will reach out to tell, is because eventually the relationship that seemed so wonderful goes south.
Yes.
And they are left feeling abandoned and in despair like they've never felt before. And that's when they start to, and it's a result of that therapeutic relationship, and that's when they start to either Google, you know, what is going on here, and then they find us. But it's usually because the relationship ends in some way. And it follows also that sort of narcissistic abuse syndrome cycle where there's a discard. And they've, you know, never, I mean, they maybe have gone through terrible heartbreaks before, but it's never like this.
Yeah.
And they just are in such despair that they start to reach out for help. So that's usually how people come to. But even then, a lot of victims will say, well, I'm just really heartbroken because this was the love of my life, and that's why I'm so sad. And they're still not able to see it as abuse.
Well, and I think it's, to me, it just seems like such a mind job on like a whole other level of, you know, you're entering initially into a therapeutic relationship. You have, you know, as the client, you have sought this person out to help you in a time of need. And it seemed like, at least from the ebook, at least a number of the stories had that, like, I was coming for help on previous abuse or panic and anxiety or depression, and then it became this abuse of, you know, like mind, body, and soul, I guess is.
Yes.
I don't know if that's the best way to put it.
Everything. Yeah, I'm really glad that you said it that way, John, because it really is this horrible mind game. And it, to me, having, you know, done all this research on it now and working with victims and going through my own ordeal, I just feel like it is so incredibly sinister. So to me, it's very similar to what happened with the clergy. But in some ways, to me, the abuse is so sinister because you are paying this person, number one, their license. So you think, okay, an authority has established that this person is okay. Often they may be covered by your insurance. So you think, okay, this person's been vetted. They've got their name on the door and they've got their whatever, their nice office. And then you are required as the client, really, if you want your therapy to work, to divulge some things that you would never tell anybody else on the planet. And that's being a, quote, good client. So, you know, so for a therapist to take advantage of all those things, and then compounded by the fact that no one comes to therapy because they're feeling really great about themselves and their lives. I mean, it really is a recipe, you know, when you have an abuser, and usually these people, you know, they do it with victim after victim. It isn't just one time. It's just, you know, everything's behind closed doors, and that power differential is just so huge that it's just, that mind game it's just so sinister to me. It's so powerful. Yeah.
It made me think of, the other myths that come with this. So we've already, outlined, okay, there's this, power dynamic of professional and client. And then, obviously because of therapy, you have a diagnosis. And I would imagine a lot of the myth of and some of the victim shaming of like, well, they're crazy, this is borderline personality disorder, or this is Munchausen, or is that a large piece of it?
Oh, yeah. And that's why victims will blame themselves. And that's why, others will blame victims, and sort of I've seen people give the therapist a pass because it's like, well, of course you would succumb to this incredibly seductive client and this is what they do. But we're trained to handle that, but it usually does not come out of those things. And even if somebody does have an abuse history, it's pretty common for people to have some sort of abuse or difficulty in their childhood. Like that's not all that uncommon. Or, from school. It doesn't have to be from their home life. It could be from school. Things happen in this world.
Sure.
And yeah, it is, it does seem like, oh, well, that person's crazy anyway. And so they had a hand in this. And then the therapist easily can deny it and say, well, that's their pathology. That's making them fantasize about these things, but they never happened.
Are you comfortable sharing of your own experience in terms of what you went through and the process
Sure.
of trying to bring that forward?
Sure. So I was able to report the colleague, and so it's all public record. And so what I share about it is that what really surprised me is that this is someone that I would never have expected in a million years. Okay. So that's one myth, is like, oh, well, I'd know who it was anyway. Right. I'd know if
they come with a big neon
no
sign.
No one did. Yeah. He'd been practicing for many years, and people who found out, it was like, he was the last person that you would think would do this. And then it was really chilling to me. And then I think what also was so disturbing about it was, he had no conflict. Yeah. And that's what you see with a lot of these abusers. They really are able to believe their own lies. So he knew that it was wrong. Absolutely. And he didn't want anybody to find out. And and this is why I say in my chapter on the ebook on the Tell site is, I don't buy when people say, oh, this was a lapse in judgment, it was a mistake. It's not, because there are too many times that we know as therapists, we know, consult, right? Whenever you're in trouble, at the first inkling, you reach out to your peers or your supervisors. And he willfully chose not to do that because he said, I knew they'd just tell me I couldn't do it.
Well, and specific to your chapter in the book, I mean, just the lengths that person went to, the defense mechanisms, and then also, just the other pieces of it of, attorneys and gag orders and all the stuff that gets used. It's just, oh, man.
Yes, the character assault. And that's what I also noticed too, and certainly now working with victims, that there is also a pattern in the abuser. There are patterns, throughout the whole situation, and there's a pattern usually for the abusers in how they respond. So usually, of course, at first they'll say, no, this was consensual. This isn't what you think it is, right? And then there's so it's sort of that denial, like, no, this is not what it is. And then they might go through a period of contrition, false contrition, where it sort of looks like, oh, I just was overcome. This isn't, I never meant to harm anybody. I thought I was helping. And so what they're trying to do is placate you and have your empathy, right? I'm just a human, those kinds of things.
Sure.
But then when push comes to shove, and certainly in my situation, I said, hey, if this is the love of your life, all you got to do is surrender your license and quit practicing and go and have a great time if you need to. But there's, if that's what you want, but you cannot practice and have this relationship, without me reporting. It's just not possible. And then that's when this person saw that I was not going to collude with him, that I wasn't going to cover it up, and that I wasn't going to keep silent about it. That's when I really saw. That's when it really got ugly. Yeah. And then like, in Jennifer Fried's DARVO, the acronym, it's like deny, attack, and reverse victim and abuser, or reverse victim and offender. He began to paint himself as the victim. And this is what all abusers do.
Yeah.
Is, that I was persecuting him and that I wasn't giving him a chance and that I wasn't understanding. It was all sorts of things. I was the scorned lover who was secretly in love with him. I was an alcoholic. I was, malicious and jealous. I was, it was all about me, right? Seeking revenge as opposed to just doing my job.
Which follows that, narcissistic and borderline personality disorder in terms of, those abusive relationships, that they often gravitate towards. That, they will, gaslight you, flip the script, and attack you.
Absolutely.
And going back to one of the things you had said in some of the other chapters, some of the other stories of that idea of like, well, I thought I was helping. To me, the ones that were just the totally sinister were the where it was like, oh, well, this is a therapeutic technique.
Yes. My colleague thought so too.
Yeah, like I'm helping you with your sexual abuse trauma through hugging you or kissing you or whatever, which I was just like, wow, that.
Oh yeah.
To just use that against them, and then it's so scary because I would think it would almost like ruin them for any therapist after. Like, how do you trust anybody in the helping profession ever again?
Exactly. And that's why, again, it's so debilitating to do this to a victim, because not only do you harm them in that relationship, but you're also harming them for future help, right? And that's one of the things that we really try to focus on when people reach out to us at TEL, is trying to isolate that this isn't all therapists. This is this one abuser. But of course, it's so hard to go back into that same, to go back into the same situation for healing that caused you so much harm is really, that's asking a lot of people. And especially because of that power differential that's inherent in every situation. And you're right, it takes them a long time, victims, to even realize that this was harm. It's very hard to accept that. And, in my situation too, that's how he justified it. He was showing her real love, what real love looks like. And she, this victim believed it. She thought, oh, the abuse cycle has ended because now I'm really being taken care of by someone who really cares for me. And of course, in my situation, as soon as he knew his license was in jeopardy, gosh, he discarded her immediately.
Yeah.
But then, as it went on, got into contact again. Oh, it's not you. It's this, this colleague is just really making this impossible for me. And so I've got to, they triangulate all over the place just to get whatever. It's all about their own gratification. They will do whatever they need to do in order to advance their own cause. It's not about the good of the client at all.
Well, and specific to your situation, did you start to have, other therapists and other people in the field, supervisors, like trying to, stop you or, oh no, that's not it. You need to let this lie.
Yeah, it was, it was very, it was so painful for me because there just wasn't enough support out there. And of course, as colleagues, when you find out about this, there's not a lot of people that you can turn to because of confidentiality. So, I did turn to my mentors, and they were all wonderful, but they had this in their 40 years of practicing, they had never come across this either.
Wow.
So they said, here's what you can do. And basically the message was just get as far away from this as you can.
Yeah. Cut bait and run.
Get as far away from this as you can. And I understand that. And then, in my own process, I just want colleagues who are listening to know that even though I cognitively knew that this is basically, and, we all know this is the worst thing you can do, short of murdering your client, right? And so I knew that cognitively, but this person was someone that I had respected and really, really loved, really. I mean, he was just such a good friend. I'd referred to him for years that even I, in the initial few weeks, I wanted to believe him.
Sure, yeah.
When he was, I was like, oh my gosh, maybe, and he was definitely pathologizing his victim to me. And I was like, oh, okay. And yeah. I regret that now that I believed him, but that is part of the grooming, right? Is this just like, and the gaslighting. And so, it took me a long time to accept.
That's something that's somewhat, a little bit unique to therapy and psychiatry because, I will say all the time, like anything could happen behind that closed door. Like it is, they're not recording sessions. They're not audio or video recording unless for some specific purpose and you got a release form or you're doing it secretly. And then we've got other ethical issues anyway. But yeah, in a lot of other professions, it's not one-on-one behind a closed door with no nurse, no,
nothing.
Dental tech or, nothing.
And no evaluation, there's no evaluation to a third party that says, yeah, my therapist is helping me or not, Yeah. And just to get back to your earlier question, there wasn't anyone who said, oh, okay, well, let's see how you can report this.
Okay.
Everybody was just like, just keep yourself safe and just get out of there, get away and, kind of like, swim away from that Titanic as fast as you can.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, I really did. Sure. I wanted to do whatever I could to get out of it, but different things happened. And then I just couldn't sleep. I really just couldn't sleep because I knew that I had to report him. But it's like reporting your best friend, or your family member, it was very painful to do that, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. I, of course, went through, gosh, what is this going to do to his family? And, and he played that with me too. He said, I don't want my children to find out about this. And it was like all on me. And I'm thinking, well, you should have thought about all those things before you
did this.
But it was amazing how, and even now, there's a lot of people who are connected with him that think I'm a terrible, terrible person.
And that process of, okay, you are someone in the public or you are a therapist, what are the options of bringing
if you find out about if you find out about a colleague?
Yeah, a colleague, or if you yourself are a client that has a therapist that did this, or family member. You're listening to OTC episode 32 with Amy Johnson of the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
I mean, I definitely, especially with victims, don't delete any texts, don't delete emails, try to keep as much evidence as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, throughout the therapy for victims, the therapist is constantly saying, delete these texts, or they're very careful. Mm-hmm. Certainly my colleague was very careful about what he put on email or text. Okay. So even though the victim might be saying something to him, his responses were pretty ambiguous. But, just try to gather as much evidence as possible. And then you certainly can reach out to an attorney. There are resources on our website for attorneys that can help you. You can make a report to their licensing board. And going to see another therapist, if you're comfortable with doing that and letting them know, they can also make a report to the licensing board. They can make a report to a membership, if the psychologist is part of the APA, for example. You can report to the APA as well, in addition to the licensing board. It's different in every state, too, because in some states, if it's sexual exploitation, it's a criminal offense. Mm-hmm. So it always depends on the state that you're in. Civil cases are very difficult on clients. They really are, because it's all about evidence and damages.
The burden of proof.
Yes, it's really hard. And there's lots of caps on malpractice insurance regarding this. And as I say in my chapter, you'll see who this therapist is by the attorney they hire and how they behave with that attorney. Okay. And they're not going to go down quietly.
Without a fight, yeah.
No.
Mm-mm. Well, and that was one of the things I appreciated so much about the ebook was I think it was the last section talks about, what are the options, and it really spells out the difference between, criminal, civil, like you were saying, if that's a membership to an association, if that's the licensing board, you have options, but I think also important to dispel any myths of, I think once a person realizes that they are a victim, that this has been abuse, and they are empowered enough to come forward, a lot of times there are misconceptions about how is this going to go down and what are going to be the consequences of it. It doesn't always play out the way that you want it to or think it will. We don't always vanquish the villain and ride off nicely into the sunset.
No, we don't. I wish I could tell you that happens. And no, I mean, even though, my colleague was forced to surrender in record time, once he was notified that he was under investigation. And I mean, talking to my board, I remember my investigator said that this was one of the worst cases that they'd seen, and that, this is an example that they will use for years to come at that board.
Wow.
He's still, nothing really happened to him. He still tried to practice. The people in his suite still let him have the office for another year. Wow. It wasn't, and even though he was not licensed, he still, I remember just seeing him walking down Main Street and in the coffee shop. These people are so disturbed that they believe their own story and they compartmentalize it, and they really believe that they're victims. And I just saw that, yeah, there really wasn't justice per se. And his victim never woke up. I mean, she really believed it was, soulmate kind of connection.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know if that's changed. It was some time ago now. I hope that she wakes up, but no, he mostly sees himself as a victim of someone like me who just couldn't handle, a different way of loving. Right.
Well, and the fact that the licensing board responded that fast, that it was in record time, that they're using it as an example for future trainings, speaks to just the disconnect, how.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I write in my chapter, his, he went through several attorneys, and the last attorneys wanted me to destroy all the evidence, which is, that's not even legal. So, and it was sort of like my refusal to comply with any of their requests was seen as me just being difficult and blackmailing. He even accused me of blackmailing him.
Yes, slander and libel.
Absolutely, the whole thing. And so I really do have a lot of compassion for victims because, here I was a licensee.
Okay.
And so I'm coming forward with all that power behind me, plus my husband, my family, my friends, my community. I had a lot of support behind me of people who knew me, loved me, cared for me. And really, a lot of victims are already isolated at that point. So it's very hard for them to come forward, It's very painful.
With advice, you were saying, don't delete text, don't delete emails. One of the things that I also took from the ebook was don't sign a gag order, don't sign a non-disclosure until you've at least really, talked it over with an attorney and, really weighed out all the options. But I guess the underlying message that I got was you need to buckle up because it's going to be a long marathon. It's not a sprint. You're going to need to really gather or rebuild support around you. Like you were saying, finding a good, safe, ethical therapist, and rebuilding that support system around you if you're going to. Try to report this and really take it through the court system. Is that?
Yes, and I think one piece of advice that I would give to people who are pursuing any sort of legal action is you really have to get out of your mind that there's any emotional sense of justice that's going to come from any of those avenues. Ugh. So the law is not a court of morals, and it's not a court of really, it's not even a court of justice. It's really a court of law, right? So it boils down to what is the law, what's not the law, and what results is that. And I think that sometimes victims are hoping, they're not doing this on purpose. I think we all do this, is we sort of hope that there's going to be some sort of TV movie moment. Yes. Where this, the villain's going to really get some great closing statement, Yeah. But it doesn't happen that way. And so even though in their minds, the police or your legal team or a judge will feel for you, but they really just have to follow the letter of the law, which is unemotional. And so you're not going to get that vindication through that avenue. And certainly I didn't feel any of that. I didn't take legal action. It wasn't really that way with me. But that's what, if you're looking to get that from the legal system, you're not going to get it.
Which is,
or especially if it's a crime in your state. If you go and you present what's happened and they say, well, nothing's against the law, I'm sorry, we have to close the case. It isn't that they don't care about what happened to you. It's just that they're beholden to the law.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I'm a parent with small children, and they, often, one will do something to the other, and they'll come, to me crying this isn't fair. I want you to do something. And I think we all have that as humans.
Yes,
of like,
absolutely.
Hey, this bad thing happened. There should be this like overarching authority that's going to step in and do something and
make it
protect
right.
me. And now, to be fair, I mean, the licensing board is there to do that. Like, that is part of what they're there for, is the protection of citizens within their jurisdiction.
Yes.
But yeah, like you said, they're beholden to their laws, their standards, their way of doing things, and what you can and can't prove, and all of that.
Yes. Yes. And especially with the licensing board as well, I always encourage people, if they are going to make a report, to look at the mission that licensing board has stated, because they can write their complaint in support of that mission. Because really, it's most licensing boards are there to protect the public interest. And we think it's to protect consumers individually, but not really. And so, like, in my case, my colleague was deemed a threat to the public health. And so, even though it's an individual situation, they were seeing it as a pattern that could potentially cause harm, to the public interest if he were to continue to practice. And so I think too, when claims get, slowed down or denied, whatever, or screened out, I think people are thinking, well, they didn't believe me. Well, that's probably not true. But it may be that because their mission is to protect the public interest, they may not have enough evidence to move forward on what you have reported.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
And I know that can be a huge disappointment for victims too, especially if they don't have a lot of evidence.
Well, one piece of advice that I give to people is, so if you're going to enter into therapy, at least I know it's this way for Pennsylvania. I can't speak for every state licensing board, but you're able to look up any disciplinary actions on the state licensing board. So you can put their name into the search bar, and you can, if you have just endless amounts of time and are really interested, I mean, you can go on to a state licensing board and just comb through all of the disciplinary actions for anybody in the state. But I often will say, hey, at least, do a little bit of due diligence, like, check it out, see if it pops up.
Absolutely. And in every state you can check a license. So, if someone were to look up my license or your license, they would see that we're active and in good standing. And there's, if you were to look up my colleague's license or anybody, you would see voluntary surrender, by discipline. So, so you can see if someone's had any disciplinary action taken that affects their license stature, right? Yes. In suspension or revoked or, all those kinds of things. And I always tell people, if you see a surrendered license, it's always the result of a disciplinary action.
Yeah.
You don't surrender your license because you want to retire.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that these therapists capitalize on. Oh, I surrendered it. That just means I wanted to stop practicing. I wanted to stop using my license. No, no. A surrender is basically you have no chance.
Yeah. It was not surrendered willingly.
Right. Exactly. And so, I really think that's one of the keys to minimizing or preventing the number of abuse victims, is that a lot of the people that I talk to, it's one of their first times in therapy, and they really don't even know what ethics in therapy are.
Yeah.
And so they don't know what is and is not correct. They don't know that you shouldn't be texting with your therapist, So there's a lot of things working with victims that, they just had no idea that it wasn't okay for their therapist to say these things to them,
Yeah, and I don't want to trigger anybody and go through an exhaustive list, but yes, if your therapist is touching you inappropriately, sending you inappropriate material, if they are let's see. Yeah, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think it starts out so subtly. And
it doesn't always start off with these big ticket things.
Right, exactly. So it's that grooming, like I was saying, like that water on a rock. It starts out really subtly. Maybe they make a comment on the way you're dressed or your hair. Maybe they ask you something about your personal life that has really nothing to do with what you're coming to them for clinically. A big factor that I see in grooming is self-disclosure on the part of the therapist that really is not clinically relevant.
Yeah.
Different, ways that they allow the appointment to run long. That's an initial grooming tactic, giving you way more time.
Yes, making you special.
Yes, making you special. Thank you for saying that, John. In any way where they're indicating to you that you're somehow different from the rest of their clients. Whether it's relaxing a policy for you, relaxing the time constraints for you, relaxing the boundaries for you, in any way is always early grooming.
Well, and some of the ones throughout the book of like telling a client about other clients.
Yes.
I mean, I have told situations of, to help that client, or I was just teaching this to somebody else, but like we're talking like HIPAA violation, confidentiality violating details about other clients. I think some of the other ones in the book talked about like if somehow you wind up doing like clerical work for your therapist of like entering their notes or doing any type of billing for them.
I mean, some people have been babysitting for them. Doing their housework.
Well, and
meeting them in
like
different places.
Yes, that was the other of lunches and dinners.
Or even just like in the office, having a glass of wine in the office. A lot of things happen in the office initially that just kind of become more datey as opposed to therapeutic, right? Yeah. Again, and it's like, because in therapy, anyone can spin anything as being clinically relevant.
Yeah.
But really, the majority of victims, vast majority, by and large, in hindsight, will look back and say, I had this funny feeling, but I overrode it, usually because the therapist has a good reputation, because the therapist is the therapist, because they want to feel better. Yes, they want to feel better. And I've one of the biggest hurdles in helping victims and helping colleagues, and certainly for myself, is really accepting that this was abuse.
Yeah.
And that it was purposeful and calculated and planned. Yeah. Absolutely. Plain and simple. And then accepting for clients that there really is that power differential, like you and I, we know that because it's just trained into us. And then when you get into your first therapy sessions, even when you're a trainee, right? It's amazing that these people are meeting with you, even if they know you're a trainee, and they still think that you know way more than, right?
Yeah.
So it's a huge power differential.
Yeah, and that was one of the other messages that I took. I know that the sexual abuse with a client is the most attention grabbing, but that idea of like it is never ever consensual.
Never.
If that is happening, it is you can tell yourself that all you want, but it is not.
It's not, and it's never equal. It's never two adults who are, like you said, consenting. And the analogy that I often use with clients, I don't know if this will be helpful to you or your listeners, is that if you are, if you tell your friend, hey, it was really interesting. My therapist was in the neighborhood and stopped by my house last night to check in on me after a difficult session. Well, people might think that's a little unusual, but they tend to go towards, wow, well, maybe that's kind of sweet in a country doctor kind of way.
Yeah.
But if you were in your therapist's home neighborhood and you stopped by to check in on your therapist after a difficult session,
You
What
probably
do you
wouldn't have a
look like?
therapist anymore.
Right. You kind of look like no one is going to give, well, wow, what an attentive client.
Yeah.
No, they're going to think you're kind of,
Kind of kooky. Yeah.
pushing the boundaries there. So the therapist in that same, it's the same behavior. The therapist sort of gets a pass towards, he probably meant well. And the client usually gets the leaning towards, what's up with you? And that tells you how different the power differential is. The therapist generally will receive the benefit of the doubt in any situation. The client generally will be pathologized. So that's enormous power that the therapist has.
Yeah, no. And that's, I think, going back to that, what we were saying before about just a complete and total mind job of, we were saying before, you think along the lines of that Hippocratic oath of at least do no harm,
Right.
And the sacred ground that we walk on as therapists and social workers of like, we are allowed to walk with people through usually the worst parts of their lives. And we are trusted to protect them and use the training to help them through that, not use our position of power and training to further abuse them. And just that idea of somebody preying upon that. It's, I'm like almost speechless. I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you said it that way. I mean, because I can feel it right now talking to you. I can feel in my heart. I mean, I said over and over again when I was going through my ordeal that I was just heartbroken. And I can feel the emotions even in this moment because it is such a privilege, the work that we do with people. And when it works, it is profoundly healing like no other relationship. I mean, I know how I feel about the therapists who've helped me in my life, and I know how I feel about the clients that I've been privileged enough to serve through their trials. And so, yes, when this happens, when someone takes all that training and all that privilege and decides to turn it into something so ugly, it hurts all of us in the profession. It really does. It hurts all of us. And it hurts people from getting help that they could need because they're, suspect of now everyone else. Yeah.
Well, Amy, I mean, one, just thank you so much for coming forward and trusting your gut and, not just cutting bait and running or pushing this away. And who knows how many people you potentially, saved from this.
Yeah, I know. It's never just a first offense. And I would later find out, even with my colleagues, sadly, that this was not his only victim.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, is there any advice that you would give? Let's start with therapists, social workers, people in the field. Anything from your experience that you would tell them
of coming forward, or
let's go with coming forward.
You mean, or in terms of like if they find out that this is happening with someone they know, or well, I would, what I wish I had done right away is I wish that I had reached out to tell. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I am a responder for them now, but I would reach out to us because that was my biggest mistake and my biggest regret. I thought that I had to do it alone. And I went to my very experienced mentors and just nobody, even if they kind of knew intellectually what to do, and we looked at the codes and saw what we were, what our duty was. But if you haven't experienced it directly and you don't understand how the dominoes fall directly, it's just a really big tangle. So I would have them reach out to tell and get some good guidance. Definitely call. Usually all of us in our malpractice insurance have some, I had like free hours. Do you have that on your malpractice? You have, a couple hours a year. Call them and ask them, because in every state, the duty is different. So in some states, therapists are mandated to report this as a crime if it is, depending on what type of exploitation it is. And in some states, you're not. In my state, I was not, which actually caused me a lot of harm because then, it looks like a choice for me to report. So that's how they could spin it in terms of that I was doing this out of malice.
Yes.
So yeah, reach out to your supervisors, mentors. I spoke with ethics professors that I had known, and do your research on the topic. And then you really do have to gauge how you're going to intervene. And I would never, ever, ever speak with this person without a third party.
Okay. Yeah.
That was also a big mistake. I in part of our codes, you and I have the same codes. There's the impaired colleague code, right, where you try to resolve it informally when you can, if there's an ethics breach. When it's something where it's, if it's just a little filing problem, that's very different. But if it's if you're talking about exploitation, I would not intervene without a third party there to listen and witness what I was saying. And I would really just pass it to someone who really has the authority to take action. It's not my job to decide. It's not any of our jobs to decide if someone is fit to practice or not. And I think that's a lot to ask of us in terms of our codes, where we try to resolve something informally and then we make the decision. No, it needs to be either given to the police, a supervisor of this clinician, to the board. You can report it to the board and let them decide. Again, gathering as much evidence as you can, but to me, it's just like if you're dealing with a sex offender, you wouldn't deal with that person
alone.
Alone.
Yeah.
And these people, people in half the states, these people are considered sex offenders if it's sexual exploitation, and they have to register as such. Yeah, that's my advice, is don't think, even if you know this person and you think that they're reasonable, don't make that mistake that I did.
Well, yeah, thank you. No, that's such a huge piece of advice.
Yeah, I really wanted to believe, and I think that's what colleagues will go through. And you really want to believe that there's just some missing piece to this puzzle that you don't understand. And we're trained to listen. We're trained to be compassionate of all situations and to seek to understand. And that's what I tried to do initially. I'm like, help me understand here, just like approaching it with a client as a therapist. And, it's just like, there's no understanding. If I said to you, well, give me a scenario in which incest or rape is okay.
Yeah.
You can't come up with one. And same with this. There's no situation. There's no gray area here. Gray area.
That idea of like the 5 stages of grief, Kubler-Ross, that like denial and anger and sadness and bargaining.
Oh, yeah.
I
went through all of those.
Sure.
Yeah. Wow. And I do want, if colleagues are listening, I really want them to know, like, you're talking to me after the fact, and now I've had all this education on the topic and I work with people. But when I was going through it, I was a wreck. I was a wreck, and I really was trying everything I could to figure out how can I just move on with my life and not report this and get, I really was. I hate to say it, but I was terrified. And so, and so that's a normal reaction. I mean, I just didn't want to believe that someone that I cared about and that I respected so much could possibly do this. There's just no way. And so my brain was really working hard to say, well, was it because he had an illness? Was he losing his mind? Is it because he was, getting older and he just couldn't handle his mortality? Blah, blah, blah. Like the whole thing I went through. But it doesn't matter if he was enduring all those things. There's never any situation where it'd be okay. Yeah.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for taking time to be on and share of your experiences. I know that can't be easy for you to dredge that up and kind of relive it a little bit.
Well, if it will help someone else, it's certainly that's what I want to do, and I really appreciate you talking about this very difficult topic and having me on your show.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the whole aim of the On the Couch podcast, is just if it even helps one person, then it's all worth it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The more comfortable we get talking about this, I think the more comfortable victims will be in talking about it too.
Sure.
And getting help. Yeah, so thank you.
What are there things that we can expect from you or Tell as we end 2019 and head into 2020? Are there major projects everybody's working on, or?
Yeah, well, at Tell, it was getting the free ebook up on the site. That took us quite a long time
Sure.
to get up there. So that's a really great resource for people now. There's the free ebook right on our home website. You can download it.
I was honored to be one of the first readers.
You were one of the first readers before it was live, and we're always wanting to add to our resources. And then for me, of course, I've been healing because I picked up my whole life and moved to a different region. I moved 500 miles away in order to heal from what I went through. And so I've been, kind of healing from everything and getting my, focusing on helping victims. But what I really do hope to do is to begin a new website where I'll have a lot of resources for prevention, and so that people can know what good therapy is and what it isn't. Okay. And so that's what I'll be working on. And, again, please reach out to Tell, reach out to me. If you have any questions, I certainly want a place for colleagues to go as well, because therapyabuse.org is we certainly welcome colleagues to interact with us, but it is really a place for victims. And so I'm also going to be working on a place where colleagues can feel like they can talk to somebody about what's going on for their current patient or a colleague that they know is an abuser.
Great. I mean, obviously sad that it's needed, but great that you're, filling that need of, obviously, out of your own experience. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'll definitely include, all the links and everything in the show notes as usual for the listeners. If anybody wants to check that out, they can head over to pfsonthecouch.com and check that out. So I look forward to staying in touch with you and seeing what comes in 2020. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. Same to you.
Take care.
Take care.
Well, that wraps up OTC episode 33. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you so much to Amy. I'm so glad that I was able to put this together and get this information out. I'll definitely have it in the show notes, but for anybody that needs it, the Therapeutic Exploitation Link Line website is just therapyabuse.org, and we mentioned it in the interview. The ebook is up on their website. I would highly recommend that. It has a lot of great chapters on, some just on people's stories of what they went through and how difficult that was, but also some steps on, like, these are actual, courses of action that you can take, and here's what to expect. So please make sure that you either check that out yourself or pass that on to somebody if you know that they've been through this. Thank you for stopping by the show and checking us out. If you can be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, that'll make it easier for other people to find it. Next episode will be OTC episode 34, where we will have a special guest, Carrie Nicholas, as a bonus episode, talking about her work with children and adolescents. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and review wherever you're catching this podcast at. You can check out detailed show notes and archived episodes at www.pfsonthecouch.com. If you want to stay up to date on future guests and contribute questions, be sure to follow us on your favorite social media platforms. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. A special thanks to the band The Topsy-Turvies for the show theme song. Their song, Like a Living Dead, can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The bump interview track was the song 1973 by Bruno E. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to editor and show producer Trevor Groff.